Greetings and welcome back to 303 and Junior English. We now turn to page 788, 789 and following in your hymnals. And we're going to turn now to Archibald MacLeish's Ars Poetica. We'll have a few things to say about that title, obviously, here in a second. But what I want to do really quickly is to kind of pause. We just finished with the Wallace Stevens offering on of modern poetry. Let's now turn and make a quick observation about the two titles remaining. We're going to look at Archibald MacLeish's Ars Poetica, and then we're going to look at Marianne Moore's classic poem simply called Poetry. All three of these poems, Wallace Stevens' offering as well as the MacLeish and now the Moore offering, all three of them share in common the following, and so we're making a 3A observation that you can obviously jot down right away. And that is, we're asking about how poetry works, why poetry works, as a way to try to define poetry, okay? By the 20th century, we have lots and lots of writers who began to ask the fundamental question, what makes a poem, right? So, for example, we make these distinctions. Roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. The roses are red and the violets are dead, sugar is lumpy just like your head. That kind of thing we don't normally call poetry, we call that doggerel, okay? But it obviously begs the question, well, how is that any lesser of value than Shakespeare's Sonnet 116, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments, love is not love which alters, when an alteration finds or bends with the remover to remove. Like, what makes one poetry and the other doggerel? These are questions that start to be entertained more seriously in the 20th century during the period that we call the modern period. Okay. We now turn to Archibald MacLeish's life, a bit of information here. Read it with me on 788. You can see your dates there. He died in 1982. So if you do the quick mathematics of when you were born, you can see that we're talking about a poet who died relatively close to when you were born, within 20, 25 years, right? Archibald MacLeish was born in Glencoe, Illinois, trained as a lawyer, but unlike Wallace Stevens, turned his back on his first career to devote himself completely to poetry. MacLeish's early poems, such as Ars Poetica, are experimental, reflecting the influence of the modernists. By contrast, his later poems are more traditional and accessible. As unrest spread throughout the world in the 1930s, MacLeish used poetry to explore political and social issues. Over the course of his career, MacLeish produced more than 30 books and won 3 Pulitzer Prizes. Let's turn now to his poem. I'm with you on 789. First of all, to the title. Write the funny title down, but then read the little bit of background information here, and it will, I hope, become clear to you. Ars Poetica. The title, Ars Poetica, is an allusion, reference, to the ancient Roman poet Horace's Ars Poetica, or the art of poetry. So there you go, write it down. Ars Poetica just simply means the art of poetry, which was composed, Horace's was, around 20 BC. Okay? You can, by the way, find a contemporary Ars Poetica, Judith Ortiz Coffer's poem on page 1366. We'll get to that one later. Okay, let's go ahead now and read the poem. And we'll play a game here of you trying to work at level 1, summarizing, and at level 2A, themes and messages. A poem should be palpable and mute as a globed fruit, dumb as medallions to the thumb, silent as the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where the moss has grown. A poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs, leaving as the moon releases twig by twig the night-entangled trees, leaving as the moon behind the winter leaves. Memory by memory, the mind. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. A poem should be equal to, not true, for all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf. For love, the leaning grasses and two lights above the sea. A poem should not mean, but be. Now, of course, that final line, a poem should not mean but be, is one of the really famous lines about poetry in the in the 20th century. But let's go ahead now and just work through it level one, putting in your own words what it is that MacLeish says a poem should be. Notice we begin with the word palpable, of or related to the senses. At the same time, moot, as globed fruit. So notice right away we've got an interesting simile, a comparison using like or as, right? Where he says a poem should be something you can reach out and touch, taste, smell, kind of like a fruit. Maybe we might say a cantaloupe or a melon. He says a poem should be dumb, as old medallions to the thumb. An old medallion would be some kind of a symbol or a reference that you could put between your fingers and you could kind of rub on it. You can feel it, but at the same time, it's dumb. Just because you're holding, for example, a World War II medallion doesn't mean that you understand all of the experiences that are contained in representing that, right? Look at the third stanza. A poem should be silent, and then another comparison here. Notice we have a series of similes, right? Comparisons using like or as the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where the moss has grown. In other words, sleeve-worn because people lean out onto the edge, right? And so it's worn out the stone. Only now the people are all gone, and all that's growing there is moss. A lot of readers of this poem have said that what MacLeish is trying to do is dance between the present, the moment now, and the past, and the ways in which poetry has this bizarre ability to kind of move back and forth between those two powerfully. Look at the next one. A poem should be wordless, which is ironic, right? Because to have a poem, obviously you're playing the game of language. But a poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. In other words, as you look up into the sky and you see birds flying, maybe together, or a single bird flying, a poem should somehow have that kind of resonance. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. Another interesting comparison, simile. The poem should have the ability to somehow feel that it's moving and at the same time motionless. Notice, leaving the poem, as the moon releases twig by twig the night-entangled trees, the way in which, as the moonlight starts to either come or go away, it somehow affects everything. Leaving as the moon behind the winter leaves, memory by memory, the mind. In other words, somehow the poem, which is a construction of the mind, seems to be able to outlast the mind, to go beyond the mind. A poem should be motionless. We've seen this once already in time, as the moon climbs. This next one is interesting. Write this one in your notes and try and put it in your own words. A poem should be equal to, notice the colon, not true. Now, there's been a lot that's been debated about what MacLeish is actually saying here in this line. Many have argued that what he's arguing or saying is that a poem doesn't have to be true. It just simply has to correspond to some kind of powerful moment in your own existence. Notice, for all the history of grief, a poem can assume all of that. An empty doorway and a maple leaf, signs, images of death, right? So in other words, a poem is always going to be there when one is sad. It's like I said recently to a group of seniors in a lecture, funny thing about poetry, funny thing about funerals. Last time you went to a funeral, did anybody get up at the funeral and start reading from the calculus textbook, from the chemistry textbook? No, I don't think so. But almost every funeral you go to, there's some kind of sacred language, poetry, that's usually shared. Why is that? Because when you come to the moment of death, there is some hope that language can maybe help us through. Look at the next one. For love, if you're going to talk about the power of poetry, the leaning grasses and two lights above the sea. It's a wonderful word picture of two lovers lying down in the grass, and therefore it's kind of flattened. And then maybe the image of two lights above the sea can either be literal or metaphoric, right? As in two lovers and their eyes looking at each other. And then a dash, and then final line. A poem should not mean, but be. Now, this is a significant idea, so let's get it in our notes. What MacLeish is going to suggest is that the most important thing about a poem is the effect it leaves on you. It doesn't have to actually teach you anything. In other words, let's say it in our own language of 303 and annotation language, a poem is less about level 1 or level 2 and way more about level 3. How you personally relate to it. Okay, let's turn now to 2A for just a second. What are some major messages or themes of a poem like this? Note the irony throughout the entire poem. A poem about poetry. MacLeish has been telling us what a poem is supposed to do, right? And yet at the very end of the poem, he's going to tell us, you really cannot define poetry. So let's write that down as a major message of this poem. Poetry, when it's doing what it's supposed to be doing well, it doesn't have to have a single interpretation. It doesn't have to have a meaning. But somehow, poetry is a compelling experience that the reader and the poem and the poet all engage in. Another possible message here is, of course, the idea that poetry captures again the things in life that matter the most to us. If not captures, certainly relates in some way to the most important experiences of our life. Love, by extension, birth, and death. The great circle of life, for those of you who are Lion King fans in the house, right? Of course, at 2B, already we've mentioned it, the use of similes in this poem are compelling. The different ones, jot down for you, what's your favorite simile in all of these? The old medallion, the glowed fruit, the flight of birds, the way the moon climbs, the leaning grasses, the two lights above the sea, the doorway and the maple leaf. Which one for you is the most compelling? The repetition of the second line of each stanza with the simile, as for a lot of these, is compelling as well. At 3A, we've already mentioned some relationships to other titles. Obviously, all of these titles that we've been working with that are trying to understand poetry. We immediately as well think of Whitman's final lines in Leaves of Grass, Farewell My Fancy, the relationship between the poet, the production, and the reader, or whoever engages the lines of poetry. This poem is trying to obviously play that same game. And finally at 3B, what is your relationship to poetry? When was the last time you needed a poem? When was the last time you needed the lyrics of a song? Maybe you were trying to qualify sadness. Maybe you were trying to qualify joy. When was the last time for you that a poem spoke to you, yes, but also spoke for you? It said something compelling. Well, there you go. Archibald MacLeish's great classic, Ars Poetica. Thank you.